Lauren Theresa, welcome to Inciting a Riot. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here.
So, for folks that have only seen the term shadow work in a caption on Instagram,
Right?
what is shadow work? And I would love for you to sort of let me know what shadow work is, both from a spiritual perspective, as you understand it as a practitioner, but also what shadow work is from a trauma counselor perspective.
Yeah.
And do those converge? Do they share a similarity? And what are the differences?
Yeah, I love that question because it is so important. And it's funny because it is absolutely everywhere right now. And I am also so happy to see it everywhere.
Mhm.
Um, even when it is kind of just in a hashtag at the end of somebody's post, because it's so needed right now. And I'll definitely, of course, go into that too. My framework and my understanding of shadow work stems from my training also as a Jungian therapist, Carl Jung, and the phrase that he had used and the context in which he utilized shadow work was a confrontation with the unconscious, a meeting of the parts of ourselves that are in the shadows, that are not there on the surface or in our conscious thought, but that are still very alive and that impact our day to day, how we react to somebody, how we, the choices we make. And it's an interesting thing because shadow work as a whole in the spiritual, soulful, and psychology community gets this kind of this dark veil over it as it's something, you're just meeting the negative or the trauma, but it also is all the parts of ourselves that we don't want to see because it might freak us out, because it might be who we actually are,
Mm.
and who we're actually, maybe afraid to admit because that means we're going to need to uproot our lives or change everything, which I could definitely speak to. But to answer your question too about the convergence, there is. It's both, and I don't think there's a clear delineation. Um, Without going too much into all of it, Carl Jung himself and like the going back into the origins of depth psychology, which is my training. It was not separate from the spiritual, and when you confront the unconscious, there's there's images, there's demons, there's voices, there's all of these things, and it doesn't matter whether you think of them as something outside of yourself or within your psyche. It's all kind of the same, if that makes sense. And there's really a lot to kind of parse out there. So I definitely am happy we're having this conversation. And yeah,
So I'm curious because when you tell me that it's the parts of ourselves that are not in conscious thought,
mm-hmm.
my brain immediately brings up the term implicit bias.
Mm,
The ways in which we interact with the world and the ways in which we interact with each other based on decisions that we're making that we don't even realize that we're making. When you see a person that looks a certain way, you cross the street. You don't At some point in your life, you're not conscious of why you're doing it. You just do it. The some of these implicit biases are there to protect us. We evolved the skill as a way of self preservation, and some of them are there because we're flawed creatures, and things like homophobia, transphobia, racism, classism, etc., get deeply rooted into our psyches from a very young age, and it's difficult to then recognize it, uproot it, and parse out, why we're doing these things and how to undo them. So, can you walk me through? Is our shadow self part of this implicit bias? Are these two sides of the same coin? Is what where are those things?
absolutely. And I completely agree with you on that. And that's part of why, it's kind of a radical statement to make, but I'm of the mindset that if we all actually did shadow work and received, and also got support, when appropriate and when needed, which I know we'll go into on the trauma end. If we all did that shadow work, that would, I think that's the healing balm, for lack of a better term, that we need culturally, collectively, individually. Absolutely.
So
Um,
it sounds like shadow work then is the process of uncovering all of those
yeah.
implicit biases, but also maybe the thoughts about ourselves that we don't like to think about. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of all that is there, that is part of us, kind of lurking underneath the surface and in our murky waters. And it's mostly what we're not fully aware of.
So, can I ask what trauma is? And when you hear the word trauma, I immediately think of an episode of Grey's Anatomy. It's really easy to see something like physical trauma,
Yeah,
right? I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
when you've been injured in a terrible accident, I think of that scene in Grey's Anatomy where the guy comes in and he's like encased in concrete, or that guy comes in and like a tree got shoved through his body. Those early seasons of Grey's Anatomy. Can you tell that I've been to that during the courses?
The
Um,
emotional that took me to, there's overlap there. Something traumatic.
but
And
it's easy to think of physical trauma, but I don't know that that's necessarily the work that you do. So what is it? What is the work that you do? What is trauma therapy?
so my within my work and within my own personal work, and also with clients and in the trauma world at large, within mental health, trauma is, it's a bit of a misconception about it, because although there are significant events that on paper are extremely harmful and hurtful and disruptive and damaging, it's more than just the event. So the trauma, when we talk about trauma, it's not so much it's not what happened so much as it is what happens after. It's
Mm.
the processing. It's the way that meaning or lack of meaning kind of unfolds after an experience. So, I can use a very concrete example. We're talking about physical trauma and talking about, for example, if you get into a car crash, that of course is a very, it can shake up every aspect of your system. One person who got into the same car crash might go home and they might walk into a very responsive environment, where
Mm.
people are asking how they're doing and how they're feeling and if they're okay. They might have been able to get some support right after physically. Another person might walk into an environment where they immediately don't have the capacity or the space, not capacity, don't have the space to talk about it, or to really go with it, or to figure out, what that even was about. That tends to be when things get stuck.
Mm.
I'm using an example like this. I don't know if we want to go into talking about or using specific words without kind of trigger warnings too around the, or content warnings around the content.
Sure, and I can put content warnings at the beginning of the episode.
Okay, cool. But yeah, so a lot of it is, it's how we process it and how things get stuck. So when we talk about trauma and emotional psychological trauma, a lot of the time we're talking about things that got stuck because they didn't get to be fully processed, understood, and we didn't get the ability to fit that into our worldview. So basically we didn't get to process it and it gets stuck. And it will often keep coming up and coming up and coming up until we're able to dive into it and to make meaning from it in a way, and to understand it in a way that can sit well within our bodies and our psyches.
It sounds like there's a lot of privilege wrapped up in the ability to process trauma.
There is. There absolutely is. I'm glad you brought that up. I feel like that in and of itself is a whole conversation. And when we talk about trauma work, it's it's easy to say, like, you should go and get support, talk to a counselor who is fully trained and licensed and credentialed, and then be able to get EMDR therapy if necessary, and then be able to see somebody, X, Y, and Z times a week. But that's not an accessible option for most people.